carrying on in Acts. But I got to let the Queen have a seat first. We can't begin until the Queen comes in. If I'm good to her, she'll give me a pity wave. All right, after Paul's conversion to Christ in Damascus in Syria, Luke tells us that he immediately proclaimed in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. And those who heard him doing that, they were floored. They were just amazed, knowing that he had persecuted Christians. They see this turnaround. They knew that he had persecuted Christians in Jerusalem and that he had come to Damascus to arrest them. So when they see him claiming Jesus is the Son of God in the synagogues, they're just amazed. Now it appears in Galatians, Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia, it appears in Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, that Paul quickly left Damascus. So he's converted. He immediately begins proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God in the synagogues. And then he quickly goes into Arabia, where he remained for an unspecified time and then returned to Damascus. And Arabia is this area. If I do ever figure out how to point this thing, I'll hit a button and something will go off, so I'm afraid to. But you see over here in this Arabia here, it's the region, it's Nabatea, which is next to Damascus. And this was an area that was ruled by King Aretas IV. And at the time to which Paul refers, Aretas, he may have controlled Damascus itself, but even if he didn't control Damascus, he had a great deal of political influence there. So Paul, he preaches immediately, Jesus, Son of God in the synagogues. He goes from Galatians chapter 1 into Arabia, Nabatea, and then he returns to Damascus. And Luke doesn't mention that sojourn into Arabia, but he emphasizes Paul's growth, which would be consistent with that. He emphasizes Paul's growth and strength and how he confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. Now, according to Galatians 1:18, it wasn't until 3 years later, 3 years after his conversion, and the way that is, it's a third year, so it can be anywhere from 2 to 3 years. So according to Galatians 1:18, it wasn't until the third year, between 2 and 3 years, after his conversion that Paul returned to Jerusalem. And this fits with the upcoming verses 23 to 26, where Luke says that he says, when many days had passed. So Paul is converted, goes to the synagogues, goes to Arabia, returns to Damascus, and after many days, meaning over this in the third year, between 2 or 3 years, he then returns to Jerusalem. And that's when the Jews in Damascus, they plotted to kill Paul, which led to his escape and his return. And they plotted to kill him because they were unable to counter his arguments that Jesus was the Christ. So Paul is proving to them from Scripture that Jesus is the Christ. And they got tired of fighting him and losing. And so, when you can't win an argument, kill the guy. And that's apparently what they decided to do. And Paul learned of their plan. And though they're watching for him at the city gates 24/7, they are guarding those gates and seeing when he comes out, we're going to get him. They're watching him. He escaped their plot by being lowered in a basket at night through an opening in the city wall. So they thought they had everything covered. They're watching 24/7 at the gates, but they let Paul down on the backside of the wall in a basket. Now, Paul refers to that incident in one of his letters in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 32 and 33, where he says, at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. So apparently the Jewish leaders who were getting thumped by Paul as he was there proclaiming Jesus is the Christ and proving to them that he's the Christ, and they couldn't counter his arguments, they decided to kill him. But apparently they had enough juice, enough power in the city to bring in the political forces, to ally with the political forces in their desire to kill Paul, because the governor under King Aretas is part of the act. So they were able to bring him in and get their assistance in trying to kill Paul, but all for naught because Paul escaped being lowered in the basket through the window. Now, when Paul returned to Jerusalem as a Christian, after an absence of 2 or 3 years, the disciples understandably were afraid of him. Right? I mean, you can see that, right? They, knowing the intensity of his hostility to the faith when he left for Damascus. So they see this guy who's just crazy, hating the church, going to killing people, going to arrest people in Damascus. He shows back up and he's talking Jesus. You see, they're going, oh, I just wonder if this is a plot to get inside, to get intel, to help destroy the church completely. You see, so they're a little leery about him doing that, so knowing that. But Barnabas, who's the cousin of John Mark, we see in Colossians 4:10, this is the same Barnabas who in Acts chapter 4, he sold a field and gave the proceeds to the apostles for distribution. Well, he brought Paul to the apostles and he vouched for him. He vouched for him. He told them that Paul had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and that in Damascus, Paul had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. He was accepted by the apostles. Paul, as Barnabas introduced him, he was accepted by the apostles, and he preached boldly in Jerusalem in the name of the Lord. Now, in Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, Paul specifies that he saw only 2 apostles on that visit, Peter and James. Now, when he says he saw only 2 apostles, he doesn't mean simply literally laid eyes on somebody. When he says I saw only 2, he means engaged with to any significant extent. So he says I really had doings with only 2 apostles on that visit, and that was with Peter and James. Now, you say, well, why does Luke put it the way he did it? Well, Luke wants to highlight that this visit marked Paul's acceptance by the church in Jerusalem, which it did. So he speaks generally of the apostles, presumably taking Peter and James as apostolic representatives. So Paul in Galatians says, I saw only Peter and James. Luke says the apostles. So Luke says Peter and James are the apostles. They are the representatives, and he puts it generally because he wants people to see that this marks Paul's acceptance by the church in Jerusalem. Paul, on the other hand, he specifies he only saw Peter and James because in Galatians he's dealing with Judaizers who apparently claimed that, listen, Paul got his gospel from a deviant or a lesser apostle. And so Paul says, no. The only people I had any significant dealings with on that trip to Jerusalem were Peter and James, 2 apostles who you Judaizers consider really good. You see, so he specifies those 2, and Luke, because of his purpose, casts it differently. But that's what I think is happening there. Now, Paul disputed with the Hellenists. Here in the Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem, that's the same crowd that had instigated Stephen's execution. You remember the Hellenistic Jews? They were chapped. They wound up instigating Stephen's execution that triggered the persecution of the church in Jerusalem. So, Paul was taking the garments when they were going to go stone Stephen. So Paul was all on board. He goes away and comes back, and now Paul's talking about Jesus. You can see why the Hellenistic Jews were upset with him. So they wind up wanting to kill Paul. It's no surprise then. And then when the Christians learned of their intention, they then brought Paul to Caesarea. You see, they take him from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and they put him on a ship to Tarsus in Cilicia. Well, that's Paul's hometown. And so they put him there, sending him to his hometown. Now, Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, that he stayed with Peter during this visit only 15 days. So it was a short trip. Well, now from Acts, we get some more details. Why was it so short? Part of why it's so short is because they're trying to kill him. And the brothers, they wind up saying, hey, you need to go ahead and get out before you get killed. Now, when Paul addresses the mob in Jerusalem that wanted to kill him, that people wanted to kill Paul a lot. They were after this guy. But when he later addresses the crowd in Jerusalem that wants to kill him in Acts chapter 22, verse 17 to 21, we learn an additional detail about his leaving Jerusalem at this time. We learn that it was in accordance with a vision that Paul received while praying in the temple. And he was told in that vision by the Lord to leave quickly because they would not accept his testimony about him. And so Paul apparently is harboring an idea that, no, we're going to have a breakthrough. I see this hostility, we're going to have a breakthrough. And the Lord tells him that's not going to happen. And he tells him here he says, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So as the brothers come and say, time for you to go to Caesarea and get out, the Lord has told him in a vision, go. So there he goes. It's not time for you to die. You see, there are other things going on with you. So go. And he goes and they take him to Caesarea and then he sails to Tarsus. Now, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 21, after his brief visit to Jerusalem, Paul says there that he went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Okay, well, he's sent to Tarsus, which is in Cilicia. And according to Acts, we'll see he later goes to Antioch, which is in Syria. So in Galatians, Paul says he went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. So people say, you see, Paul there, he's saying that he first went to Syria. Well, that's not true. You see, as Marshall says, the fact that two regions are named in that order, Syria and Cilicia, instead of Cilicia and Syria, they want to say that Paul's claiming there that he first went to Syria instead of went to Cilicia and then to Syria. Well, that's not what Paul's saying. You see, they're trying to read that into it. So as Marshall says, the fact that two regions are named in that order in Galatians 1:21 need not mean that Paul worked in Syria before going to Cilicia. In fact, his work in Antioch, the capital of Syria, followed his time in Tarsus, as you know from Acts. Followed his time there. At this time, Syria and Cilicia formed one province, and it was natural to name the more important partner first without implying that Paul necessarily visited the two areas in the same order. Okay, so I mentioned that in case you run across that and you go, oh no. Okay, all of these things I tell you, just breathe deep. Breathe deep and dig around, and you'll find out. All right, now on the brink of the report here, right on the brink of Luke's report of the expansion of the church to Gentiles, Luke provides a general summary of the state of play. And following Paul's departure to Tarsus, he says that the church throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and was being built up. Now you notice that there hasn't been any specific mention of evangelism in Galilee. But obviously it was going on, right? And that should come as no surprise. It's right there. But there hadn't been any specific mention of evangelism. But here we see that it had gone on and that the church had spread there. So, as you'd think. Now, living their lives in reverence for Christ and in the comfort or the encouragement provided by the Holy Spirit, the church multiplied. So here's the state of play right before we go out into the expansion of the message to Gentiles. Now let me just give you quickly what is a probable partial chronology of Paul's life. I've shared this with you before, but I know how you are. You don't remember anything. All right. You're just like I am. So here's Paul's conversion. Now this is, like I said, I believe Jesus is crucified, resurrected in AD 30. Now, the debate goes between AD 30 and 33. If you're somebody who says, no, I'm convinced it's 33, well, then you're going to shift these things around. But 30, taking that, Paul's conversion is probably 33 or 34, and there's some wiggle room. That's why I do it this way. You see, there's some margin of error here. But 33 or 34, he's in Damascus, then he goes into Arabia, comes back to Damascus, and he's there for 2 or 3 years. So you have some built-in wiggle room because it's in the third year. It could be 2 or 3. Okay, so he's in Damascus. Then he has that first Jerusalem visit we looked at. Then he's sent to Tarsus. Then we have Peter's Gentile ministry. And then Paul comes from Tarsus to Antioch, you see, in 43 to 45. Then we have the second Jerusalem visit. That's the famine visit. Then we have Paul's first missionary journey. Peter then visits Antioch, which is referred to in Galatians 2. Then Paul writes Galatians. He writes Galatians from Antioch. He's had his first missionary journey where he visited the churches. He's back in Antioch, and that's when he writes Galatians. Then you have the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, Paul's second missionary journey. There's more to Paul's life, but that's all you're getting right now. All right, so Peter here in Acts chapter 9, 32 to 35, he was traveling among the churches outside of Jerusalem. Peter's traveling there, and he's certainly teaching those churches truths of the faith, and he's probably evangelizing in all of these areas where he goes. And when visiting the Christians in Lydda, which is a city, it's about 25 miles northwest of Jerusalem on the road to Joppa, when Joppa's on the Mediterranean coast, he discovered a man there named Aeneas, probably a Christian. This person had been bedridden for 8 years as a result of being paralyzed. So he apparently had some kind of fall or an accident, something that had paralyzed him 8 years ago. And since that time, he'd been in bed. You know, there were no kind of halos and medical treatment like this. This guy's he's paralyzed 8 years ago. Now here you see a map here from Jerusalem, about 25 miles to Lydda. And then it's another 11 or 12 miles to Joppa on the coast. And Peter says to Aeneas, he says, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed. And immediately he rose. Now this command, rise and make your bed, it probably refers to the consequences of the healing, that he will henceforth be able to spread his sleeping mat on the floor without needing other people to do that for him. So that's what I think what he's saying, rise and make your bed, rise and enter into a new kind of life, one in which you are ambulatory. Okay, as you had been before you were paralyzed, rise and make your own bed, enter into that life. Now all the inhabitants of Lydda and these towns in the plains of Sharon, north of Lydda, they saw the paralyzed Aeneas walking around. They knew who the guy was. They knew he'd been paralyzed. I'm sure this was a story. What happened? Oh, it wasn't that terrible about Aeneas. He fell off the roof, paralyzed. And he's been in his bed. Oh, his poor wife. Man, can you imagine what a headache that is for her? But I mean, this guy was known. Now he's walking around. And news of that became known. It became known in Lydda because all the people there, when Aeneas would be there. And it became known in the towns and the plains of Sharon north of Lydda because either when Aeneas would go there or when they would come to Lydda to visit. So it all became known that this had happened. And recognizing that great miracle, you had large numbers of them turn to the Lord. Now he says all. And a lot of times you see it's just like we say all. Like if you say somebody was telling a joke and everybody was falling out, do you think you mean literally everybody? No, what you're saying to people and what people understand when you say that was it had a huge impact. There was most everybody was falling out. All right, so that's how language is used. Okay, so that's what I think. I think we just call it hyperbole, where he's saying all doesn't mean it's a misrepresentation. It's understood to have impact. Like if I told a joke and everybody was falling out, you'd know what I meant. You'd know that I had a big impact, and that's what he's saying. Now, Joppa, it's about 11 or 12 miles from Lydda on the Mediterranean coast. It's the main port city of Judea. And among the Christians in that town, there's a woman whose Aramaic name was Tabitha. And that Aramaic name meant gazelle. And so her Greek name, rather than transliterating her name, looking for a different kind of name, her Greek name was simply a translation So Tabitha in Aramaic was gazelle. What's the word for gazelle in Greek? It was Dorcas. Okay, so that's why she's called Dorcas in Greek and Tabitha in Aramaic. But here is this woman who's there in Joppa. And he goes there and he finds her. And well, she's there. Peter sees her. And in Peter's time of his travel, this woman, first, she was somebody who was very well respected, right? Because we see that here. She was full of good works and acts of charity. She was very well respected. She's exemplary. She's probably wealthy because of her acts of charity. And at the time of Peter's travels, she becomes ill and dies. And then her friends, that's the they, when it says here, it says, and when they had washed her, her friends then, they prepare her for burial, but instead of burying her promptly, as you might have suspected, they laid her body in an upper room. And you just kind of scratch your head and say, I wonder what that's about. Well, as bodies in upper rooms, those things were connected to resuscitations, to returns to life. In some Old Testament accounts, right? Like 1 Kings 17:19, Elijah and the widow's son, 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 10 and 21, Elisha and the Shunammite woman's son. You have these healings, these returns to life done in upper rooms. Well, that may reflect a hope. The fact they washed her and put her in an upper room, the other disciples, that may reflect a hope that God somehow would do the same for their dear sister as had been done in those Old Testament texts. Now, we're not told that, but we are told she's put in an upper room. And so when you start thinking about what could be motivating that, what's going on, that is a possibility there. Now, hearing that Peter, he was in nearby Lydda, he's only 11 or 12 miles away. Well, then the disciples in Joppa, they sent 2 men to urge Peter to come from Lydda to Joppa, and he did. So they hear, whoa, Peter's down there. Go get Peter and bring him up here to Joppa. Now, when he arrives, they take him to the upper room where Dorcas had been laid. She's prepared for burial. She's up in this upper room, and the house is now filled with mourners and the widows who perhaps had been blessed by Dorcas's generosity. She was known for works of charity. Here are these widows who are in need, so they perhaps had been beneficiaries of her generosity. They stood beside Peter weeping and showing him the various garments that Dorcas had made for them. Garments they may have been wearing. And we don't really get that, you see, because clothing was a bigger deal then. It was something that could be very expensive and valuable. And she's making these things for them. And they're just crying and going, look at what our just devoted, sweet sister in Christ made for us. And there they are crying with Peter. Now, Peter sends everybody out of the room. And he kneels and prays. And he then turns toward the body. And he says, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes and sat up. Man. Right? I mean, look, he says, Tabitha, arise. This dead person, we're not talking about, she was dead for 4 minutes. No. This flat dead. Up. I'm talking praising God here. Now, John Polhill in his commentary says, as with Jairus' daughter, the widow's son at Nain, Lazarus, and Dorcas, it was not a matter of resurrection, but of resuscitation, of temporary restoration of life. But all the miracles of raising from the dead are in a real sense signs. You see, they're indications of what Christ will do on his return to all people on that day. But see, in resurrection life, and he says pointers to the one who has power even over death and is himself the resurrection and in the life for all who believe and trust in him. So Peter, he gave Tabitha his hand to help her up. And then he called the saints and widows and he presented her to them. And you can imagine people the impact this had. And that phrase, when he says saints and widows, it might mean saints, including some of the saints who were widows. But it also could mean saints and also some widows who are not Christians. Because as Marshall says, he says it's not necessary to assume that Tabitha helped only Christian widows. So it's possible there that those widows, that you have two distinct groups instead of one being a subset. But he says here, the saints and the widows, and this great miracle became known throughout the city. And it led to many conversions. And Luke notes that Peter stayed in Joppa for many days with a tanner. That was his occupation, a tanner, a man named Simon. Luke stays there for many days, and that's where that's where Peter is staying. When in the next section, he's called to Caesarea. So as we're going to see, he's in Joppa when he gets called from Caesarea. And Caesarea is about 30 miles up the coast, about 65 miles northwest of Jerusalem. So Peter's still in Joppa when in the next section he gets called to come to Caesarea. And now Caesarea Maritima, that was a city that was built by Herod the Great. And this city, it's the center of government for the Roman administration of Judea. This was like the capital or something. This is the center for government administration. It's not Jerusalem. They would come down to Jerusalem when there was a festival or something that concerned them. But generally, the administration of the province is conducted from Caesarea Maritima, from this city that Herod had built. Now, there's a Roman centurion there named Cornelius. He's stationed there, and he's a devout Jewish sympathizer. He's a Gentile, but he's a Jewish sympathizer who engaged in pious works like giving alms, in other words, helping the poor, and praying, but he was not a proselyte. He was not a full convert to Judaism, someone who had undergone circumcision, someone who had taken the full plunge, who was submitted to all the Mosaic law with all the food laws. In other words, he was not a Jew. He is what is called a God-fearer. He's a Gentile who's sympathetic and interested in Judaism without being a convert to Judaism. And that's significant because, see, unlike the Ethiopian official, who I argued to you was in fact a proselyte, a Jew, here we have a pure Gentile. And we have a Gentile, and that's going to be significant because that is the significance of the extension of the gospel to Gentiles here. And that's the thrust of the whole narrative of what goes on with Cornelius. And about the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's an hour of prayer in the temple. And Cornelius probably is praying himself. He sees an angel in a vision, and he's terrified. You know, these angels aren't these little fat babies with wings that are always thrown around. They're awesome. Absolutely awesome. And he sees this angel and he's terrified, but the angel quickly assured him that God was pleased with him. So he's not there because he's on God's bad side. He lets him know that God is pleased with him and he's taken favorable note of his prayers and his deeds of charity. That God had taken favorable note of that, and the implication being that God will grant his prayer, as he does in the unfolding narrative. And so the angel instructs Cornelius to send for Peter in Joppa. So Peter's down about 30 miles south in Joppa. He tells him to send for him there, and he told him precisely where he's staying. We have divine GPS here. He tells him he's at the home of Simon the tanner, which is located by the sea. So that's where he is. You send for him. And the angel indicated that Peter would present a message. Now, this isn't here, but in chapter 11. When he's recounting the thing there, he's recounting it before the council. The angel indicates that Peter would receive a message from the Lord, would deliver a message from the Lord by which Cornelius and his household would be saved. And this is a message that Cornelius is eager to hear, as you see in 10:22 and 10:33. Now, when the angel left, and Cornelius dispatches, he's a centurion, he dispatches 2 servants and a soldier to invite Peter to come. And he told those guys what had happened, so when they invite Peter, they'll be able to explain to him what's going on. You know, what are you talking about? Why do you want me? And so he's equipped them to be able to tell Peter, this is why we are here, and they could explain that. Now, around noon, as the men from Cornelius, coming from Caesarea to Joppa, as they approach the city of Joppa, Peter went up on the roof to pray. And he becomes hungry, and as his food's being prepared, he fell into a trance. And he's given a vision of this great sheet that is descending from heaven. From heaven, it's by its four corners, okay? So you think of a sheet this way, four corners of the sheet, those four corners are being held up. It's full of these things, and that big thing is descending. And it is full of all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds that were unclean for Jews. So here comes this sheet full of unclean animals down out of heaven. And a voice told him, the voice says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "By no means, Lord. By no means, for I've never eaten anything that is common or unclean. I've always been kosher. I've always lived by the Jewish food laws." And so people say, well, look at him here. He's fighting God. He may think it's a test. Right? He may think it's a test of, well, no, kill and eat. And his response should be, no way. I'm with you. Right? And so this goes on, this conversation, if not identically, at least in substance, goes on 3 times. This conversation happens 3 times, and then the sheet's immediately taken up to heaven. And what's obviously happening, you see, in emphasizing to Peter the obsolescence of the Jewish food laws, God was freeing Peter from any scruples about going to a Gentile home and eating whatever might be set before him. Otherwise, when these people come from Cornelius and they say, hey, come on down and meet and gather and hobnob with Cornelius, he's going to say, I can't do that. I'm a Jew, and we keep away from Gentiles because we have all kinds of regulations. Part of the reason for them was to create a wall of separation between us and them. And you see that in Ephesians 2. That was one of the results of the law. And he says, so God has, what has he done? He's explained to him, don't call these things unclean that I've said it's okay. So he's now going, okay, and he's going to explain this when he gets there, in fact. So as Peter's trying to make sense of the vision, well, the voice comes, he comes the second time, what God has made clean, do not call common. And that happens 3 times and then it's taken up. And then as Peter's trying to make sense of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius, they show up. They arrive at the house, and the Spirit says to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. I've showed you this. I've showed you don't call what God has made clean, don't you call common. I'm telling you now, it's good and right for you to go. I have sent these people to you. I'm doing something, Peter. I'm doing something. And this gospel is going to go out now. The next step is going to be, it's going to go to the Gentile world. Ugh. So he lets him know that he's got something going on here. So Peter, they tell him, look, you go with them, I've sent them. And Peter goes down, he meets them, and he asks why they've come. And they tell him that Cornelius, that a holy angel had directed Cornelius to send for Peter, to have him come to Cornelius' house to hear what Peter had to say. And the men, they spent the night, and the next day Peter and 6 Jewish Christians from Joppa, they head out from Joppa to Caesarea, to Cornelius' house. They head out with Cornelius' men for Caesarea, and that trip would have taken the whole of one day and part of the next. And Cornelius is waiting. So he had dispatched his people down there, and he's waiting for them to come. And he's called together his relatives and his friends. He's got them down there just waiting for them, expecting them to arrive. He's got a group all waiting to hear this message. And when Peter enters, Cornelius falls down. So from Cornelius' perspective, this angel has appeared to him and said, go send for this guy. He's thinking, this guy is something. I don't know who he is, but the angel told me to bring him. So when he comes in, he's... And Peter's going, no, I'm a man. Okay, I'm just a man. And so Peter has him stand up. And then Peter went into the group that had been assembled by Cornelius. And he explains to them because they would know that a Jew would not be here. So he's thinking they're going to look at me and say, this guy's not even serious about his own faith. And he explains to them why he as a Jew was willing to come and be with them. And that's what he tells them. He tells them that contrary to how they know, they were aware that Jews weren't allowed to associate with and visit Gentiles. But he says God showed him that he should not call any person common or unclean, meaning that he should not exclude them from social interaction because they were not Jews. So they wanted to know what he's doing. He says, God has showed me that I should not exclude you from social interaction because you're Gentiles. Because God is going to bring the Gentiles in. And so he tells him that. That's why he came when he was invited. And then he then asked Cornelius why Cornelius sent for him. And Cornelius explained the angelic vision that prompted the invitation. And he thanked Peter for coming. And he said, now therefore we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you've been commanded by the Lord. They were primed. They were ready to hear the word. And so they're all just there. Give it to me. Wouldn't you like that? They're all there, just give it to me. And Peter begins by saying that he understands that God does not play favorites. In that he accepts people from all nations on the same basis. Anyone in any nation who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to God. And his point is not, it is not that one can be saved apart from appropriating the atoning death of Jesus Christ, but that no person is barred from accepting the gospel because of his nationality or race. That's the point. No person is barred from accepting the gospel because of his nationality or race. It is for all people. It is for all people. And in light of Christ's appearance and work, accepting the gospel, see, that's part of what it means to fear God and do what is right. In light of Christ's work, that's part of what it means. David Peterson says, this does not mean that Cornelius was already saved before he met Peter, but that non-Jews are acceptable or welcome to come to Christ on the same basis as Jews. See, through faith in Jesus Christ. And these Gentiles, you'll notice, they were assumed to be generally familiar with Christ's life and his ministry. He says in verse 37, he said, you yourselves know what happened throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee after the baptism John proclaimed. See, so these Gentiles are assumed to be generally familiar with Christ's life and ministry, but they had not heard. They had not heard the saving message that Cornelius had been instructed to invite Peter to deliver. They had not been instructed about it. They had not heard that saving message. At the very least, that means that they had not heard of Christ's nature or status, who he is. They had not heard of that. Or they had not heard the theological significance of his work. They had not had those truths proclaimed to them. So they were aware of his ministry. They were aware of his life in doing these things. This idea that there were people who thought something about him, but they had not had the saving message preached to them. They had not been instructed about his nature or status or what he had done, what he had accomplished, what was behind that crucifixion and resurrection. And Peter proceeds to tell Cornelius and the others gathered at the house, he proceeds to tell him that Jesus is the Spirit-anointed, miracle-working, devil-opposing Lord of all, who was crucified, resurrected, and appointed the judge of the living and the dead. And then he says in verse 43 that it had been prophesied of Jesus that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins in his name. Now, while Peter is still preaching, okay, he's told them about the nature and status of Christ, who he is, what he's done, the forgiveness that is available through faith in him. And while he's still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell on those hearing the message. Now, this is a reference to Cornelius and the other Gentiles, the family members and friends that he had gathered there, those to whom Peter was speaking. It's those who were hearing the message for the first time, as explained or as identified in chapter 10, verse 24 and 33. For example, Ernst Hanken, in his commentary, says, the Spirit falls on all the hearers, that is, Cornelius, his relatives and his friends, not Peter and the Joppa Christians, who are rather the witnesses to attest to this event. And Richard Purvo says, only Cornelius and company received the gift of the Spirit, permitting Peter and company to serve as objective witnesses. The Jewish Christians already had the Spirit. You see, and this is God is doing something for the Gentiles. And you can see this. This is indicated by the fact that Jewish Christians present, they were amazed. You see that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles. And it is the Gentiles alone who are presented here, who are said to be speaking in tongues and extolling God. And when Peter recounted the event to the church in Jerusalem, he twice specified then that the Holy Spirit fell on them. The Spirit fell on them, meaning the gathered Gentiles, in distinction from Peter and the 6 Jewish Christians who had accompanied him. The Spirit fell on the Gentiles as he had previously fallen on the Jewish believers at Pentecost. And Peter makes that same distinction when he speaks of the event at the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. Indeed, the focus of the entire Cornelius narrative is on Gentile acceptability to receive the gospel. There was tremendous Jewish resistance to this. So God is working to let the Jews know, Jewish Christians, to say, hey, we went to Judea, we got the Samaritans, we're not stopping. Gentiles too, baby. Gentiles are coming in. And see, you see after all of these centuries of the Mosaic Law and the distinction that God had for a certain purpose, he's now saying, no, the Gentiles are coming in. And so the whole narrative, the Cornelius narrative, is on the acceptability of Gentiles to receive the gospel. They can receive the gospel and they can do so as Gentiles. They can do it as Gentiles. I heard that bell. Okay, so no. I know you may think, yes, we always know that the Gentiles can come in, but they're going to come in through converting to Judaism, and then with us, no. They're coming in as Gentiles, you see. So this is going to be a huge thing, and the Spirit's coming, and I have much more to say about this, but bells are bells. All right.